Welcome to the Green Alliance podcast. We are the charity and think tank dedicated to achieving ambitious leadership for the environment. I'm Ruth Chambers, Senior Fellow at Green Alliance. In this episode, I'm joined by Lord Krebs, a crossbench peer from the House of Lords, and Richard Benwell, Chief Executive of the environmental coalition Wildlife and Countryside Link. And together we reflect on the third anniversary of the Environment Act, which was passed in 2021. John, thank you so much for spending the time to share some reflections on the Environment Act, which was a really big moment for Parliament, for the UK and for the environment sector. But casting your mind back, could you tell us why environmental laws matter and why this Act of Parliament in particular was perhaps so eagerly awaited?
Thanks very much for inviting me along, Ruth. It's really good to be able to chat to you about this. It's sort of self-evident that environment matters. We've got to protect our water, our air quality, our habitats, our species, our soils, and so on. And most of the protections for our environment before Brexit came from Brussels. So nearly all of environmental law was European law translated into the UK. So when we made the decision to leave the European Union, the then government said we want to match or even exceed those protections. And the Environment Act was part of a suite of acts. There was also the Agriculture Act and the Fisheries Act that set out how this was going to be achieved. And my aim, along with others who scrutinised the bill and tabled amendments, was to try to ensure that this promise that we would protect our environment at least as well, if not better, than we had done before, that promise was actually embedded in law. And so we tabled amendment after amendment, and we fought long and hard to try and strengthen the bill to make sure that our environment was protected for future generations.
And I remember those debates well, and many of them went on until the early hours often, especially when you got to the voting stages on amendments. And of course, we had the COVID pandemic in the middle of the bill as well. So it took a really long time. But as you say, making sure that those protections were embedded in law was really such an important aim to have. It's actually been 3 years since the Environment Act got royal assent. So this November marks that anniversary. And I think my recollection of the passage of the bill was it was long, as I've said, and sometimes testy, because despite the government's aspirations for what they termed a green Brexit, they certainly didn't agree with all of the amendments or the ideas that environmentalists were suggesting and parliamentarians were putting down as well. But from that long passage, do you have any standout memories from its journey, especially through the House of Lords stages?
I certainly have some standout memories. I mean, as you mentioned, Ruth, some of the debates went on long into the night. And I think the government was trying to wear us down, but we stuck it out and carried on voting right through until sort of 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. But for me, probably the single biggest moment was when I went to see George Eustice, who was then Environment Secretary, along with leading figures from the Green NGO movement, RSPB, Woodland Trust, Wildlife Trust, and so on. We tabled an amendment which made a strong commitment on biodiversity. And that amendment was to halt the decline of species by 2030. Originally, the government had conceded as far as saying we'll aim to halt the decline. And we wanted to strengthen that from an aim, which is a vague commitment. You don't know what it's going to mean in the end, to actually we will halt the decline of biodiversity. And for me, the really standout memory was not when I spoke to George Eustice about it, but when the Green NGOs spoke up. That's when I thought that George Eustice really took it on board. And that reflects for me something that went on throughout the Environment Bill debate was the fantastic support that I had from Greener UK, the consortium of green NGOs. So that one word change from aim to will, I thought was a real standout moment. And it shows how, in scrutiny of legislation, it's not necessarily the big picture. It's often very small changes, single words here or there, that you can strengthen the legislation. Now, whether the government's actually going to be able to achieve the legally binding commitment to halt the decline of biodiversity by 2030 is another matter, but at least it's there in law. So there's the opportunity for us to hold the new government's feet to the fire because they've made this promise, they supported it when we tabled the amendments.
I mean, that's brilliant to hear you say that. And I actually remember that meeting happening. I remember the groups going in and the pictures of it. And I think there was even a picture of the moment with George Eustice himself. And that was, as you say, a successful campaign that persuaded the government to voluntarily change that one word, but nevertheless a really significant word in the bill. One of the other things that we through Green UK and in partnership with parliamentarians and, lots of other groups, including businesses, were really keen to embed in the Environment Act was a strong new replacement national governance system. And that ended up being in part one of the Act. I think it's fair to say ended up dominating a lot of the parliamentary debate. Certainly most of the briefings that we shared with parliamentarians were about things like how to put environmental principles like the precautionary principle into law. And then the one that I think was probably the last debate left standing in the House of Lords, wasn't it? But, the independence and the strength of the Office for Environmental Protection. I wonder if you have any reflections on that in particular, because we had lofty ambitions for how we wanted that national governance system to be set up, didn't we? And we knew that it wasn't possible to replicate it entirely within our own national governance system because the EU is a supranational being. But while we didn't get everything we wanted, we certainly made some big strides along the way. But what are your thoughts on the governance system that the bill ended up establishing?
Yeah, you're right to say, Ruth, that was probably the last debate standing. As my crossbench colleague said, we want a new watchdog with real teeth, not just with flashy dentures. And, well, we did end up in a better place than where we started. Of course, the background, as you said, Ruth, is that when we were in the EU, the ultimate sanction was service of an infraction notice, which could be followed up by a court fine from Brussels. And I remember one former minister saying to me, there was nothing ignites government action as much as the thought of having to pay a fine to Brussels. So we wanted to replicate that as closely as possible. We didn't succeed in getting a body that could issue fines to the government. It'd be quite difficult for a government body, an executive agency or an NDPB to fine the government. But we strengthened the role of the OEP. Glenys Stacey, the first chair of the Office for Environmental Protection, has really done a brilliant job in showing that the OEP is unafraid to speak truth to power. Its last annual report, produced in January 2024, was a pretty damning indictment of the government's failure to meet the targets in the Environment Act and indeed in other acts that also help to protect the environment. So I think we've ended up not quite where we'd like to be, but you don't expect to win everything. But we've ended up at least with a powerful independent watchdog that can report to Parliament and hold the government to account. They do a lot of detailed analysis and their reports are hard-hitting.
I agree, and we're so grateful for the work that the OEP does, the quality of the analysis, and as you say, it's unafraid to speak truth to power. So just going back to the passage of the bill for a minute, and you mentioned that we didn't win everything that we wanted to as a coalition of parliamentarians and campaigners, if you like. And I don't know if you know this, but all of the votes that we collaborated on and peers ended up deciding to push the government on were won on the Environment Bill. It was quite an extraordinary track record. And for those listening to the podcast that maybe are a bit uninitiated as to how this process works, quite often stakeholders might brief into parliamentary debates. We might even suggest amendments. We may publish articles in the media to raise public awareness of debates before they happen. But once the debate starts in the chamber, then it's all down to those parliamentarians who turn up to speak, who form cross-party alliances, and who take those brave steps of challenging the government and in sometimes deciding to put an amendment to a vote. And it feels from the outside when we're watching it live on Parliament TV, like it's edge of the seat stuff. And, you've got your parliamentary popcorn in your hands and quite often it's unclear as to which way a vote is going to go and so forth. But How does that kind of endeavour feel from actually a peer's point of view and being in the chamber?
Well, there are two key things, really. Because of the numbers in the House of Lords, the commitment of the independent crossbenchers, people like me who are not party political, they're the ones who hold the balance of power, if you like. Because in the previous government, the Tories had significantly more peers than Labour and even Labour and Lib Dem combined. So it was only when the crossbenchers put their weight behind an amendment that it could be actually supported in a vote. But the other thing is the way that certainly I and David Anderson and others who were closely involved worked really well together with the opposition and with the Lib Dems. So I think it's as you say, Ruth, the striking thing about this was there was a real unanimity. Not really because of party politics. I'm not a party political person. It was just about wanting to protect the environment and really ensure that this Act of Parliament would do its very best to save the precious environment that we have for future generations. I often describe myself as a puppet who was standing up, speaking the lines, but actually the hard work, the heavy lifting of thinking through the wording of amendments, spotting the opportunities, that was done by Greener UK. So it's a really fantastic effort from everybody in the House of Lords and from the Green NGOs. So I think it was a great team effort.
I think for many of us involved on the Environment Bill, but on the other bits of the post-Brexit jigsaw, if you like, it's probably going to be one of those things that, throughout our careers, we look back on with great pride, but also a great sense of satisfaction and enjoyment, whilst realising that the process of protecting the environmental law remains unfinished business. So coming back to nature then, and as we've talked about, we know that the Environment Act is better for nature than it would have been if we hadn't have put our collective minds together. It states on the face of the Act, which I think is unique in legislation throughout the world, a legally binding commitment to halt the decline in nature. And it gives the government powers on biodiversity, air quality, water quality, and resources and waste. So it really is a powerful framework. But 3 years on, are we making the most of that framework? We are still in the UK, one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. And as you mentioned, the OEP has found that we're largely off track against delivering not only the targets in the Act, but also the goals of the government's environmental improvement plan. The first thing, I think, or one of the first things that the new government did on the environment was to announce that it was going to undertake a rapid review of the environmental improvement plan to make it fit for purpose. So we're all busy feeding into that. But the government's in quite a demanding position now. We had the budget earlier on in the autumn, which sets quite a challenging financial context, and yet the government's ambitions and aspirations for the environment remain unabated. How do you think it can make progress in these challenging circumstances?
It's a really good question, and the targets are very demanding. And for me, part of the challenge for the government is that they have these targets, but ministers sitting in Whitehall may have sort of targets, but they don't have actually any direct control over their implementation, because the individuals, the bodies, the organisations that are going to actually deliver cleaner water, cleaner air, more restored peatland, better habitats for species, those people are not in Whitehall. They're all spread around the country. And that's why I, with the help of Wildlife and Countryside Link, have put forward a private members bill, which is going through the Lords at the moment, and I hope we'll complete its passage by mid-autumn. That bill would place a duty on a large number of public authorities, including regulators like Ofwat and Ofgem, including local authorities, including landowners like the Forestry Commission and National Parks authorities, place a duty on them to contribute to delivering the targets in both the Environment Act and the earlier Climate Change Act 2008, because those are the organisations that actually can deliver on the ground. I'm hoping, even if the government doesn't accept my bill, they will accept the spirit of it and use it in order to increase the leverage they've got to deliver these targets. And one way they might do that, you've already referred to, Ruth, is they are doing a rapid review of the Environmental Improvement Plan, which is the sort of framework for delivering the Environment Act targets. And they could incorporate some of the ideas in my bill into the revised Environmental Improvement Plan. But I think that's really one of the key things. How do you go from aspiration to action? And I think that's really what the new government has got to face up to. I think the other piece of the jigsaw is actually what we saw in the Agriculture Act under the phrase public money for public goods, which is all about paying farmers, if they're getting taxpayers' money, paying farmers to help to restore nature. And I think that hasn't really landed properly yet. When I talk to farmers, they're quite confused about the plethora of schemes. They're not quite sure how to get the money, not quite sure what they're supposed to do. When you talk to DEFRA officials, it's not totally clear that they understand how the pieces of the jigsaw fit together and how they're going to measure the outcomes effectively. So I think we need to watch this space. And I noticed that the budget did include, I think the number was 5 billion for the transformation of agriculture to support nature recovery, including the number I've got written down here is 400 million for tree planting and peatland restoration. So the indications are there is some money there, and it's a question of spending that money wisely and in being able to measure the progress towards improvement of nature that results. Will we move from talking the talk about enhancing a nature recovery to actually delivering it? And we've got a long way to go.
I really hope we do, but we have no choice, do we? Because if we don't, then, we will continue to be a nature depleted country. And not only will that affect our wildlife and plants, it will affect our economy and our health as a society. I really hope that your bill makes progress. As you say, it may be in the guise of the Environmental Improvement Plan, but unless we're equipping the hundreds of public authorities that will need to put their shoulder to the collective wheel of delivery, then it's really difficult to see how the government's going to be able to achieve its legally binding targets. And in some cases, those public authorities, their founding legislation is so old, it's, several decades ago that they were established with quite different purposes and duties before we realised the extent of not only the environmental crisis, but also the need for those authorities to play their full part in helping address it. Thank you so much for, not only what you did on the Environment Bill and the other bills that we haven't had time to go into today, like the retained EU law bill and others, but also what you continue to do, often out of sight in Parliament for championing the environment through parliamentary questions, debates, ministers' meetings, drafting bills, the list goes on. It really is so appreciated by us all. But looking ahead to the future, the UK government ministers have just come back from the biodiversity conference in Cali. As we've talked about, the Chancellor's delivered a budget, and yet nature's never been more important in our lives. We've got probably around 4 years of this current Parliament with a government that, as we've noted, is committed to delivering for the environment, but also has lots of other priorities on its to-do list. It's got 5 missions. Clean energy is one of those. Nature isn't, although it seems to be tucked away, at least implicitly, some of those. But do you have any aspirations for the next 4 years within the Parliament?
Well, I think if we look at the Chancellor of Exchequer's big autumn budget, a lot of that is about rebuilding the infrastructure of the country. And for me, the environment is a crucial part of our infrastructure. And we've got to actually push that message that it's not just a nice to have add-on for people who like tree hugging or bird watching. It is actually an essential part of our infrastructure. And as Partha Dasgupta's review of biodiversity for the Treasury, commissioned by the previous government, showed, it's essential economically for our future economic health. We need to have a healthy environment. It provides ecosystem services, whether it's soils for growing our crops, pollinators for pollinating the crops, carbon storage in peatland and in forests. It provides those services, and unless we nurture our natural environment, we're going to lose those services, and before we know what's happened, we're going to be in deep trouble. So I think although it's not top of the agenda, we've got to frame the argument in such a way that it is part of the agenda of economic recovery and infrastructure recovery as much as nature recovery.
Thank you so much, Lord Krebs, for speaking with me today to share your reflections of the Environment Act and for all that you did to make sure that the Act was passed as quickly and as ambitiously as possible.
Thank you.
I'm now delighted to be joined by Richard Benwell, Chief Executive of the environmental coalition Wildlife and Countryside Link. Richard, you were a key player in shaping the Environment Act, both when you were an advisor to DEFRA Secretary Michael Gove, but also through your leadership of the environmental coalition Wildlife and Countryside Link. And we spent countless hours together, didn't we, hatching plots to strengthen the bill, working with parliamentarians, businesses, journalists, and many other people. So it's great to have the chance to reflect on what the Act has delivered, but also where it's yet to achieve its full potential. First then, let's go back to the campaign and the long passage of the bill through Parliament. When you look back, do any particular moments or favourite things that we did together stand out to you from the campaign?
My memory of the Environment Act campaign goes much further back than the bill itself. And I think it's always worth remembering that the idea of the need for something that set legally binding targets for nature recovery, for spatial planning for nature, for ways of grabbing some cash and forcing investments so needed for so long in restoration of our natural environment. That went way back to 2013, 2014, when folk were comparing where we were on the nature side with the climate change situation, where the Climate Change Act was really starting to ramp up investment in the clean economy. And that need for that core driving legal instrument combined, didn't it, with the situation we were left in by Brexit and that governance gap left by the loss of the Commission and courts to present an inescapable argument for new nature legislation. So it's good to remember that long history. And then when the bill came, goodness me, there were so many exciting twists and turns, weren't there? I enjoyed so much working with Green UK before I went to be an advisor at DEFRA, and those days working through the European Union Withdrawal Act. For me, a favourite moment right on early on was working on what we ridiculously geekily call the Combi Amendment, that required new legislation to fill the governance gaps left by the environmental principles and the European courts, as I recall. And that was a really fun moment. And that was what compelled the need for draft legislation, wasn't it? And was a really great turning point.
And actually, that was one of my favourite moments too, that campaigning on what became the EU Withdrawal Act, because without that legally binding requirement on government to bring forward, as you said, a draft environment bill, I often ask myself, would we even have the Environment Act today? And of course, we'll never know the answer to that question. But at that point in time, the commitment was to fill the governance gap, to set up a new oversight body and to put environmental principles in law. And it wasn't until Theresa May, when she was Prime Minister, was persuaded by the arguments to broaden it out and take the opportunity, because Environment Acts don't come around very often. The last wholly dedicated one had been back in 1995, and she was persuaded to make it a kind of proper full-blown environment bill. But I remember she announced that in a tweet. There wasn't a press release on gov.uk, and half the sector missed that tweet. And then when we shared it around, we all got terribly excited because we knew that that was the moment, as you said, to bring together the campaign on Brexit, closing the governance gap, with those aspirational campaigns to set nature targets in law. But when the bill was published, and obviously there were various kind of changes that it underwent, it had to battle with long delays because of COVID. Parliamentarians were themselves pushing for things to be added and the bill to be strengthened. But it didn't have a nature target on the face of the bill. There was a framework to set targets in a number of policy areas, but it wasn't a specific, as we went on to call it, a North Star target for nature. Tell me a little bit about the State of Nature campaign and how you managed to persuade the government to put that target in the bill.
Yeah, well, when the bill was first published, there weren't really any legally binding targets at all when we first got an eye on the bill. And it was at that stage that I went into the other side and joined DEFRA and became an advisor and worked with you in a new way. I think I was brought in not least to work on bolstering the bill from something that felt like a catch-me-up on Brexit to something that the government could rightfully, proudly present as something that it was doing positively for nature. But there were all sorts of obstacles in the way. If there's one thing that will bring down the portcullis of power in Whitehall 10 times out of 10, it's the introduction of legal risk. Throw in a good blob of uncertain financial risk in there, and you've got full murder holes and knights in armour at the door to prevent your policy aspiration. And I remember early on when we discussed the idea of adding legally binding targets for nature recovery into the bill, the reaction within government, apart from DEFRA, was one of, how do I say it nicely, a great scepticism and incisive questioning about how robustly we could say that these targets could be set and met. And there were some really amazingly dedicated civil servants, very small team in DEFRA, who were tasked with evidencing that it was possible to set and meet a series of environmental targets. And at that point, we were out to you and the team at GUK and around the sector on practically a daily basis to say, help us, give us the evidence that drawing up these kinds of pathways is possible and won't be legislating for something that's impossible to do. And that early hurdle of proving that it was possible to set a direction of travel for nature and doing it in law was massively important. And it was only later, coming out again from government, that we got onto the question of the North Star target for biodiversity for 2030.
And thank goodness that eventually that campaign to put that target in succeeded with the help of an enormously impressive coalition of parliamentarians, with the weight of the NGO sector standing behind it. As you said, a lot of people in government pushing from within, and the business community, groups like the Aldersgate, recognised the benefit of having legally binding targets because they would give certainty to the business community. So slowly but surely, the government realised that putting a target in law was not only good for nature, but good for business and good for the public too. So that was a success story when we look back now, perhaps, and we'll come on to in a bit how we feel the Act is actually performing and whether or not the government is using all of the tools and the powers at its potential, because there's a lot in the Act that it could be doing. For me, another success story of the Act is undoubtedly the new oversight body, the Office for Environmental Protection. We all fought so hard, didn't we, for that body to come into being, for it to be as independent as possible. There were lots of debates about what powers it would have, what access to remedy it would have, lots of different analogies about what kind of watchdog it would be. Would its bark be worse than its bite? But I think from where I sit, it's had a real impact, and I can't now imagine our national system without the OEP. And, if you, fast forward to a mythical point in the future where suddenly we were maybe a member of the EU or another kind of trading bloc like that again, I don't think I'd get rid of the OEP. I think I'd want it to be there forever. But do you think that our new national environmental governance system, is it shaping up in the way that you envisaged?
Yes, I think so. There are definitely bits that I would have liked to see stronger and I think still could be strengthened. But I think the OEP has really asserted itself on the policy landscape with the kind of intellectual authority, but clarity of expression that we need to say whether the government is on track or not. And through all these things, I should just say that I'm sure that we wouldn't have got anywhere near as far as we got without your linchpin personal role, Ruth, in bringing together the sector and bringing together parliamentarians to stand up and fight for it. And we had fun at every stage, and it was brilliant to see things like the public campaigning coalescing around those key targets and things. But the reason that was able to translate into a parliamentary result was thanks to the basis of trust and effective core of parliamentary power for nature that you had pulled together and done so much for. But yeah, the OP, what a great watchdog. It would be really fun to think what our dream version might have been, as well as acknowledging that it's doing a great job so far.
Thanks, Richard. That's really kind. And you've reminded me that when governments work on bills, they like to concede as little as possible. It's just a kind of negotiating strategy. And they use a tool called a concession strategy, where I think it looks a little bit like a league table of things that the government will potentially give on, things it will give on if it's really kind of pushed by environmental campaigners and parliamentarians, and absolute red lines which it will never cross. And we had our own version of that, didn't we? Where we knew that the Act wouldn't be successful from our point of view if we didn't achieve certain things. Northern Ireland is another really important angle of all of this, because, of course, the environmental governance system that the Environment Act put in place also largely applies in Northern Ireland. I was delighted recently that for the first time, the Northern Ireland government has published an environmental improvement plan. So it's a slow step on the hopeful road to nature's recovery, because Northern Ireland's environment is in a pretty dire state, as we all know. But I thought that was really good to see that at least those early steps are being taken, whereas without the Act, then it wouldn't have been possible to do that. But you're well up in Countryside Link and you cover England, but do you have any reflections on the state of play across the rest of the UK?
There's huge merit to having a system where the 4 countries can chart their own path to environmental improvement, and where the opportunity is for countries to show the way rather than be dragged up behind, and to learn from each other. And I think at times that has struggled because of difficult relationships between the 4 governments. And having the Environment Act in there to help make sure that there was at least a baseline of expectation has been a good thing. I mean, as I look across the 4 countries now, I see worrying signs in each country about fallback on environmental commitments. I'm worried about the approach to farm payments in Wales and in Scotland. I'm worried about the fact that environmental targets legislation is a long way behind in the other countries. I'm worried about the lack of an integrated approach to things like 30 by 30, which after all are a UK commitment and are being tackled separately in the 4 countries. So it's really good that the Environment Act has at least proven a spur to raising that 4-country ambition. I think as the UK, we've yet to find a way to allow the kind of freedom to innovate, freedom to lead on the environment, while at the same time making sure that the 4 jurisdictions add up to the scale of environmental improvement we need. And I hope things like the Global Biodiversity Framework strengthens everybody's resolve in that.
And I hope that the promised reset that the new Prime Minister has suggested is underway across the 4 governments of the UK will also create just that more positive context for those discussions to take place. Previously, it seemed that relationships had broken down and it wasn't possible to have the sorts of conversations about joint delivery that we would have all hoped, because we all know, don't we, the environment doesn't respect administrative boundaries, and by working as 4 nations together, we're always going to be stronger and deliver more than our respective individual parts. It reminds me, though, that there are parts of the Environment Act which would apply across the whole of the UK, but they haven't been activated yet, which kind of, it's mind-boggling, because here we are 3 years later when the Act is celebrating its 3rd anniversary. And the most obvious one I'm thinking of is a measure that would have introduced a new due diligence scheme on forest risk commodities. The scheme itself was suggested well before the Act got royal assent, so probably around 4 years ago or even longer than that. And yet it's still not live, which I think is both a tragedy and a failure of political leadership. But what can we do about this when, an Act is passed, most of its measures are implemented, and yet there are 1 or 2 things which just really struggle to get going?
I can scarcely believe it when this happens, and there are several examples, aren't there, in the environmental world of Parliament agreeing a measure that then sits on the statute book without being activated for years and years because of lack of executive will or time. A couple of classic examples: Schedule 3 of the Flood and Water Management Act that would require sustainable drainage and then the automatic right to connect new housing developments to the sewerage system. Great bit of law sitting there unactivated. Last year's Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, there are really, really good measures to require local plan development to take account of local nature recovery strategies. As we're shaping those local plans for nature recovery, going through all this effort to bring together farmers, businesses, communities, and think about how they can work together to restore nature, that crucial bit of legislation is sitting, not doing its job on the statute book. And forest commodities is another absolutely vital example of this. What I'd like to see quickly is for government to find its resolve on all those things. I appreciate that there's a packed legislative timetable, but it's surely not beyond the wit of the whips and the powers to come up with ways to add those into the timetable. And in time, I think we need more parliamentary scrutiny on those things that have been agreed by our democracy and not turned on by our executive, and maybe an expedited procedure for doing that when parliamentary time really is short.
So one thing that the cross-cutting Environmental Audit Committee has suggested is that the Environment Act, now that it's 3 years old, should undergo some kind of post-legislative scrutiny. It's a process that exists in the UK Parliament, but as I know from a course that I did recently with parliaments from across the world, we don't use it half enough compared to other legislators. So the Environment Act, I think, would be a good candidate to kickstart that process and to make sure that we are not only passing good laws, but also assessing how well they're working and how they could be improved. But what I think you're talking about, Richard, is delivery and implementation, as well as just assessing how good laws are when they're passed. And that, I think, takes us nicely on to something that the new government has made a priority, which is reviewing a document called the Environmental Improvement Plan. So the Environment Act put in place our new governance system. We've talked a lot about one of the 4 pillars, the Office for Environmental Protection. We've talked a bit about another, the legally binding targets on nature and other environmental areas. The third is a new duty on policymakers to take environmental principles into account. And the fourth is this Environmental Improvement Plan. It's a legal document. The government chose to make the existing 25-year Environment Plan the first EIP. And I think when the plan was published, we looked at it and we thought, gosh, well, it's a very long document. There's a lot of good words in there. But where is the delivery focus and what is this plan really going to achieve? Because it had lost some of its kind of coherence and focus. So I feel encouraged that the new government has set in place a process to have another look at that plan and to come up with a new version. But what would good look like to you from this review, and what are you hoping for?
Good question. I think it's worth saying that there was loads of good in the 25-year plan, particularly that original version of the 25-year plan. The people who worked on it and wrote it did a really great job, and it set out a new scale of ambition and it described the need for environmental action really well. When it turned into the Environmental Improvement Plan, though, and became the rudder for the government's resolve in meeting its environmental targets, that's when it really needed to turn from a descriptive policy document into an implementation plan to do something. We've had many a lovely description of nature recovery, haven't we? But for some reason, it doesn't get translated into action on the ground. So what I'd like to see from this version, which is really great that the government has listened and agreed to strengthen the plan, what I'd like to see is a really sharp analysis of the effort needed to meet each of the statutory targets in the Environment Act, an attribution of action to the main policy areas needed to deliver those targets, with as much rigour as possible an assessment of how much contribution you expect each of those actions to make. I'd like to see responsibility for delivery and a timetable laid out for each of those main actions. And that might be a government department, it might be an agency, it might be businesses and third sector or a combination of those. And beneath that, I'd like to see the enabling changes that we expect the government to make to help those things happen where they're not already. So a predictable investment plan, suggestion for regulatory change to enable things to happen. What are the facilitative measures that the government could take to make sure that those things happen, which might turn into an investment plan, it might turn into a white paper for change. It would be wonderful if that's what it turned into, as well as something that can be easily interrogated year on year. And if it's not working, crank up the dial. It's worth saying that there are a few things in the current environmental improvement plan that don't fit within that neat framework because they're not statutory targets. Things like people's connection with nature and that really important commitment to making sure everybody can access nature within 15 minutes of home. It's important that those aren't lost, and it would be great to see those elevated and action planned in the same way in the new EIP. Very final thing that I ought to have obviously said as we sit here watching the exciting negotiations in Colombia at COP16 is that the new iteration must get that magic line between international commitment through national pledges right down to local delivery and implementation. If they can do something like that, then we can have hope that in 5 very short years' time, we might actually be on track to halt that decline of wildlife.
Absolutely agree with all of that. And I think now with the negotiations in the biodiversity COP in Cali, it really should help focus minds. And I would like those ministers and officials that are out there leading those negotiations to come back with a renewed purpose and direct it into that review of the environmental improvement plan. And in the longer term, I would like it to look and feel and act more like a carbon budget, and that would help give nature greater clarity with climate in law and in delivery. And as you said, there are lots of things which aren't Environment Act targets, but are still really important. So just concluding then, we've had this Environment Act 3 years. It's delivered some good on the ground. There's lots of potential. But everyone always wants more legislation, and people never get as excited as when there's a new environment bill on the blocks. The government's started with its first session with one environmental bill, looking at water companies and how they're regulated. It's got, I imagine, another 4 years of its legislative programme left to run. Looking ahead within that time frame, what would your advice be to the government on environmental legislation?
Put some time in for it, definitely, but don't retread old ground, break new boundaries and do something cool. Every government wants its landmark bit of legislation, but the Environment Act can be that. It gives us that framework of ambition, governance and principles, core of delivery planning that we need to turn around the state of the natural environment. What I'd really love to see from them next is something, for example, to bring that promise of the Dasgupta review to life. So we know we're going to need loads more investment in nature. The Green Finance Institute think it's 4 or 5 billion quid a year we're short to hit our targets. And yet at the moment, we rely on a very small pool of public investment or very nascent, very narrow compliance markets for investment in nature. If this government were ambitious, it would remember what it said in the run-up to the election about making polluters pay. It would remember what it said about recognising that nature is fundamental to the economy. And I would love to see some sort of polluter pays green finance bill that properly sets out obligations on key polluting sectors to disclose their effects on nature, so building on the sorts of forest commodities stuff that you were talking about earlier, positively plan for nature recovery alongside climate recovery, and critically have a compliance duty to invest not just in making good the immediate harm that they might do, but actually invest in nature's recovery. And in a time of tricky public finances, it's that sort of bold economic intervention that might be needed to help really drive nature's recovery. But there are probably 6 bills that you could choose make a real great difference. I mean, wouldn't it be wonderful to think again about strengthening our land management and that sort of thing? But I think they've got a great foundation in the Environment Act, and now it's about implementation.
Thank you for listening to this Green Alliance podcast. Please do keep checking in, as we'll continue to bring you specialist interviews and highlights from our events here on your podcast feed. You can either subscribe on your favourite podcast app, or you can follow us at Green Alliance UK on X and Green Alliance on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. Please do join the conversation and share thoughts, questions and ideas, and use the hashtag Green Alliance Podcast. See you next time.